Willkommen in einem neuen video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 5 of my series on Neu-Schwerpunkt. In this video, I will be looking at a recent game I had and the lessons I learned about being able to make effective command decisions or to not make effective command decisions. First, let's cover the rules I used, which were Neu-Schwerpunkt. Neu-Schwerpunkt is a figure game conversion of a board game, in this case the SPI Modern Battles folio board game. In these rules, each element represents a battalion, each game turn a day, and the player commands a core-sized formation. The game that I'll be briefly describing used a card-based ad hoc scenario generation system. Each player had a selection of 9 formations and 9 special events cards, which they shuffle and randomly select. The points value varies based on when the formation arrives, and each side, in theory, has a points equivalent force mix for the entire game. Or to summarise, you spend 15 minutes creating a unique ad hoc scenario which presents you with a unique situation that you will probably never faced in the past and will probably never again in the future. The benefits are you will never get the same game twice, so in theory you should not ever get bored. The disadvantages, on the other hand, is you will be presented with a unique situation which you have never faced before and with no prior knowledge of the situation or time to analyse. This can lead to great disasters, as I have discovered in my last game. The card decks are all based on actual historical campaigns. In this case, I selected the Operation Uranus and the German counterattack, which occurred between November 1942 and January 1943. After the card selection process, the initial forces I had on game turn 1 were 2 rifle divisions. I was attempting to be the defender, with a tank corps coming in at the midpoint of the game as a counterattack force, or at least that was the cunning plan. It was a cunning plan, but unfortunately I was outsmarted by my German opponent, perhaps accidentally, but nonetheless this was what occurred. My German opponent started with a single German infantry division, which was a suicidally weak initial force mix for most games. However, as all I had were 2 rifle divisions, this instead was a brilliant stroke. In this card system, the side which starts with the largest force is the attacker and has to enter the playing area in an attempt to take up to 3 objectives. 2 rifle divisions were simply not going to be an effective attack force in this particular case. With 2 infantry divisions, I was never going to take all the objectives, so I focused on the only one that was closest to my player edge and decided to concentrate all my infantry on that particular flank, with 1 infantry division going for the objective and 1 infantry division trying for an outflanking manoeuvre. This turned out to be the wrong strategy, but it was all I could think of at the time. The issue I had was infantry was slow, and infantry is not really a very effective attacking force. I threw my rifle divisions against the German-held objective for 3 days and only took it on the 4th day after I managed to assemble all my artillery. I quickly discovered, and I should have really realised at the beginning, the only way my poor old infantry were going to successfully attack was with massive levels of artillery support, which took time for me to arrange. I only got the artillery together on day 3, and by day 4 the Germans were forced to retreat after taking some losses. On day 4 I received another rifle division. If I'd only placed my tank corps here instead, but alas, I never expected to be the one attacking. Unfortunately for myself, the Germans received a Panzer division on day 4, which luckily for me arrived on the far German left flank, well away from the conflict area. Unfortunately, a German Panzer division was capable of very rapid movement. The Germans drove across the playing area within a day and struck my rifle division on the 5th day. My newly arrived rifle division attempted to counterattack, but without all my artillery concentrated together, it was not going to push the German infantry division to its front backwards, no matter how stretched the German infantry division happened to be. The game resulted in a German substantive victory, and I was left to ponder what could have I done differently to avoid this fate. At the time, I thought that I was doomed from the beginning, but after much thought, I discovered that there was possibly a strategy I should have actually tried. The major point I failed to notice at the beginning of the game was that a single German division covering what was a 72-kilometre frontage left the Germans incredibly weak everywhere. The Germans only defended key strong points, leaving massive gaps in the front line. I was unable to see where the gaps were as the Germans used hidden units, and when you use this option you place a large number of markers on the playing area, of which only half are real and the other half fake. Thus I did not know where the Germans were strong or weak. The Germans also used their anti-tank battalion as a very mobile reserve, as it was motorised. In fact, it was the only motorised unit the Germans had. After much pondering and thought, and actually advice from my German opponent, I realised my advance should have been across a very wide frontage, as I had more battalions than the Germans. Once I detected actual resistance, I would rush the artillery and my reconnaissance battalions to that location to launch an attack. Even if my attack failed, I would have eventually detected the gaps in the front line and advanced much further than I originally had with the tactic I originally adopted. When we analysed all the hidden units, what was real and what was not, we realised, that is myself and my German opponent, that I would have been able to advance closer to the central objective, as well as being able to take the original objective on my right, which I took in my original game. I wouldn't have been able to take the central objective because the Germans had too much defensive there, but I would have got fairly close. The German Panzer Division would have then driven back my forces from the central objective, not the far right or far right flank objective. And I would have been in a much better position for my tank corps to take advantage of. The tank corps was going to be arriving on game turn 7, and the closer I was with the central objective, the better the chance I had of taking it. The game would have descended into a struggle for the central objective, which if I could have taken, would have given me a draw, so that's an upside, and if I managed to keep it to the end of the game, which may have been a bit unlikely, it would have resulted in a win for me. This actually got me thinking, how many gamers who create a plan and then get thrown a curveball then decide to basically lose before they even begin the game? My cunning plan is foiled and I'm doomed is a very common quote, possibly in this case. Instead of just basically giving up at the beginning, as in retrospect I effectively did, what you need to look at is look at what you have rationally and try and assess the best plan based on the situation on the ground without losing the will to win and not worrying about any prior plan that you may have created. With historical scenarios, you have a good idea of what you can do and what the result of the scenario is. It gives a figure game scenario. If you're given a figure game scenario of an unfamiliar battle, you can actually study the scenario before the game and do some analysis to determine what may be the best strategy to use or not. That is the normal gaming scenario that most players are familiar with. However, when you use a card-based ad hoc scenario generation system, you don't have a scenario before the game. You don't have a historical campaign that you can study to determine what's possible and what's not. You are instead left with a situation that is completely unknown and which you need to immediately resolve and solve. As a counterpoint, it is true in a real-life situation a commander would have, let's say, 8 days to think about an 8-day military action, as well as some time before the military action to think about options. On the other hand, a real-life commander would rarely have a 20,000-foot view of a battlefield that a figure gamer would typically have. So I suspect both these pluses and minuses tend to even themselves out. While the card-based system I now use for Schwerpunkt or Neu-Schwerpunkt was originally designed for 2 different sets of Napoleonic rules, and I have since made versions of the card deck system for other micro-armor rules and even some ancient sets of rules, it did work surprisingly well. In fact, it's worked surprisingly well using pretty much all the rules that I've used with it so far. Even though I lost this game, I now realise I was presented with an unexpected situation and I failed to make the correct decision rather than any basic issue with the card-based scenario generation system victory conditions. Because of the way so far a ad hoc card-based scenario generation system tends to be working with all the rules I've done so far, I plan on creating additional sets of cards for different sets of rules. And basically the only thing that really differs are that the force mix cards have to reflect the force or the elements for the rules that you're using. But otherwise it pretty much works much the same with any set of rules. I think it works reasonably well and I'm quite pleased with that. What I'm not particularly pleased with is my ability to make instant command decisions. And so, as I am led off into the distance by the NKVD to the gulags after my failed frontline experience, I end my Part 5 video, in this case called Analysis of a Failed Commander video. This was, as you could probably imagine, not a playthrough video, as I found after a while they can get a little bit boring, especially when you're dealing with such a simple game system as Neu-Schwerpunkt. Instead, I wanted to try a format where I ponder the lost opportunities and wrong or correct decisions made during a game instead, and determine if the game system itself can deal with those sort of aspects in a historical and accurate manner or not. I think generally that at the high level, I think the card-based system works quite well. The rules that I use, Neu-Schwerpunkt is an incredibly simple set of rules, which most figure gamers would probably turn their nose up, but at least I can play them in a very short period of time and teach them very quickly, and I don't see any particular major issues with that. So generally, I think this scenario or this experience has been comparatively positive, except of course my stay over at the local gulag. Alle guten Dingen, kommen zu einem Ende.